Today's episode is brought to you by Patricia Humienic's poetry collection, We Contain Landscapes, a tantalizing debut by an author who's heralded by Aria Aber as a vibrant new voice to American poetry, weaving in letters and innovative forms and haunted by questions of desire, borders, and the illusion of national belonging. We Contain Landscapes is called Intensely Beautiful by Victoria Chang and shot through with radiance and self-possession by Joanna Klink. For every reader who harbors a voracious longing to encounter infinite landscapes and ways of being, this incisive collection dreams toward a more expansive idea of kinship, of how we become beloved to one another and to ourselves. We Contain Landscapes is available now from Tin House. I'm not only excited about today's conversation with Torrey Peters because of how much enthusiasm the airing of her craft talk last year on the show called Strategic Opacity was met with, and not only because her latest book is one of 4 novellas in 4 different genres that engage with gender across a 10-year period of Torrey's life when her own notions of gender and representation of gender were changing, but also simply because Torrey is a great guest and a great thinker, where the questions she poses in her work and in our conversation, whether they lead to an answer or provoke more questions, expand our sense of possibility both in art and in our own lives, I think. For the bonus audio, Torrey contributes something special, a reading of the first thing she wrote after transitioning back in 2013, a zine called How to Become a Really, Really Not Famous Trans Lady Writer, which she reads for us in its entirety, all 20 steps. This joins many contributions, whether Matilda Bernstein's Sycamore reading from her forthcoming book, Pterodactyl, or C.A. Conrad reading Memories of Why I Stopped Being a Man, written in celebration of the 50th anniversary of Le Guin's Left Hand of Darkness, a 3-part essay where each part weaves in quotes from Le Guin, autobiography from C.A. Conrad, and ending with Conrad's poetry. Access to the bonus audio is only one of many things one can choose from when transforming yourself from a listener to a listener supporter when you join the Between the Covers community. Past Between the Covers guest Anne DeMarkin, who wrote one of the best books of the last year in my mind. She's also the head of A Press, The Third Thing, which makes these incredibly beautiful books, the quality of every choice in their design an act of love. And also, like Torrey's novellas, they often cross and blur the boundaries and borders of category and genre. Books that trouble the relation between a performance space and the written page, for instance, or a lyric noir written by an evolutionary biologist. And she put together bundles of these Third Thing books to offer supporters. And there's also the Tin House Early Reader subscription, receiving 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public. Those and a lot more. But regardless of what you choose, every supporter at every level of support is invited to join our collective brainstorm of how to shape the show and who to invite going forward, as well as, and perhaps most importantly, receiving a robust amount of supplementary resources associated with each and every conversation. You can find out more about it all at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's episode with none other than Torrey Peters. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest, the writer Torrey Peters, has an MFA from the University of Iowa and an MA in comparative literature from Dartmouth College. After moving to Brooklyn to join the Topside Press trans literary scene, Peters self-published 2 novellas as part of her project to promote a self-publishing culture among trans writers. One called The Masker was about online sissy culture, female masking, forced feminization fantasies, internalized misogyny, and cross-dressing, and was illustrated by the writer, artist, and portraitist of trans women, Sybil Lamb. The second was a biomedical sci-fi hormone revenge story called Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones. And with the success of these books, and with a shift in receptivity to trans narratives in mainstream publishing, Peters leapt from self-publishing to one of the big publishing houses with her best-selling and critically acclaimed debut novel, Detransition Baby. Heralded by everyone from Roxane Gay to Garth Greenwell, Gia Tolentino to Carmen Maria Machado, Andrea Lawler said of the book, an unforgettable portrait of 3 women, trans and cis, who wrestle with questions of motherhood and family making. Detransition Baby will definitely keep you up late and might destroy your book club, but in a good way. Elif Batuman calls it a noteworthy advance in the history of the novel. Vulture adds, reading this novel is like holding a live wire in your hand. And finally, Jordy Rosenberg exclaims, Torrey Peters just took everything that couldn't be done and did it. Plenty of books are good. This book is alive. Detransition Baby was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. It was longlisted for the Women's Prize, named a Best Book of the Year by everyone from Vogue to Esquire to NPR, and was named one of the New York Times 100 Best Books of the 21st Century. So it's with no small amount of anticipation that we welcome Torrey Peters to the show to discuss her latest book, Stag Dance, a collection of 4 novellas, or perhaps one short novel called Stag Dance, surrounded by 3 novellas, 4 narratives in 4 genres that already have everybody talking. Imogen Binney says, this is what I want from fiction. It starts at a place of real vulnerability, goes all the way down its own rabbit hole, and ends up potent and strange. Miranda July says, Torrey Peters is often describing something that has never been described before, and it's never something minor. It's something massive that has been missing from our understanding and enjoyment of the world. Stag Dance is hot, heartbreaking, and thrillingly victorious. Finally, Julia Phillips says, her words divine and her characters brutally real, her talent awe-inspiring, her vision immense. Her writing tears your guts out. It leaves you gasping. This is fiction that makes you drop to your knees, fiction at its very best. Welcome to Between the Covers, Torrey Peters.
Thank you. That was I wish you were available for all my introductions. That made me feel really good.
It could be my new career.
Yeah.
I could tour around.
I had to tell Random House that they've got to give me my entourage. I think.
Yes.
I guess. Not that you're volunteering. You're like, no, sorry, I have a podcast to do. But
yeah.
I can dream. I can dream.
You can dream. Well, even though Stag Dance is this incredibly entertaining read, sexy, provocative, often laugh out loud funny, heartbreaking and heartwarming in equal terms, I think, moving, edgy, and more. I feel like before we talk about it, I have to at least acknowledge the moment in which we're talking and how Trump's barrage of executive orders from day one have had at the forefront a focus on a massive reentrenchment, cultural reentrenchment to a binary notion of gender, with a direct attack and rollback of transgender rights, a banning of trans women and girls from sports and schools under the threat of having federal funding pulled, banning from serving in the military, prevention of trans athletes from obtaining visas to participate in the Los Angeles Olympic Games. passports and visas being issued to trans Americans in contradiction to their declared gender, websites providing transgender health information going dark, and direct threats and attacks on hospitals and clinics offering gender-affirming care, and the removal of federal funding from any medical school or hospital that researches gender-affirming care. We don't have to talk about this at all. This isn't the focus or even the tenor of your book, but I wanted to at least create the opportunity for you to speak into the moment if you want to, as you now enter this public-facing period of introducing Stag Dance to the world and accompanying it out into this world. And if not, to have at least spoken myself about the climate within which we're having the conversation.
Well, first off, I want to thank you, especially for listing all of the things. I think a lot of people hear one or they hear another, and they, when you start hearing of all of them, and even also of the things that the people that he's appointed are doing outside of even the executive orders, relevant to this podcast, for instance, the fact that like anyone who they said promotes gender ideology, but just basically means trans or writing about trans stuff, is no longer eligible for NEA grants. So like there's a real chilling effect in arts institutions, and that wasn't even in an executive order. That was just people being like, let's freestyle on this, and see what else we can, what other kind of bigotry we can come up with. So I appreciate that, everything you said. And I do actually want to speak to it. I mean, I think it's been a real change for me. When I published Detransition Baby, I never would have guessed that I would say, well, this is the high watermark of trans freedom. But weirdly, I seem to have hit it in that moment, at least the high watermark for now. At the time, there weren't that many books by trans writers out. I felt sort of thrust into this position of representation where I was representing all trans people. And I really was like, I wouldn't say I resented it, but I was uncomfortable with it. I didn't want to say like, speak to trans politics. I didn't want to do this sort of stuff. I wanted to say, I wrote one book. A lot of what's in that book is pretty weird and idiosyncratic. And I wouldn't say that like, I would certainly say that like not all trans people, and in fact, maybe even a majority of them wouldn't endorse my positions. So I can't speak for trans people. I made that point like over and over. And, I almost feel the entire opposite as I did then. I'm publishing this spring, even as there's all these, this barrage of, as you say, like executive orders and bigotry that's specifically targeted at trans people. I also happen to be speaking at a time where there's an unprecedented number of trans books being published. I mean, I can't even list them all right now because it would take too long, but just thinking briefly, Jamie Hood, Trauma Plot, Heron Walker, Aggregated Discontent, Jean Thornton, ASL, Aurora Mattia, and Sex Me Here. I mean, I could just go on and on and on. Hot Girls with Balls, which is a great title. I haven't read the book, but I'm just waiting for it. It's about it's a tennis romance, maybe a volleyball romance. There's in all these different genres, there's people publishing, and as a result, I really don't feel that I'm sort of like a de facto representative of trans stuff. And as a result, I also feel that like the act of solidarity is to, if I'm given a platform now, to really speak to it, to speak to this is going on, to not say, oh, I'm an artist, I want to talk only about my book. Like it has become so oppressive and so present that it actually is in all the art. Yeah. I wrote a piece for New York Magazine in the end of January, right after the passport thing happened, where Trump said that if you renew your passport, your gender marker is going to be changed involuntarily to whatever your sex at birth was. I've had F on my passport for 10 years, and I have to renew it next year. And on top of that, I live part-time in Colombia, and you get stopped by the police a lot in Colombia, which means that in the future, every time I get stopped by the police in the middle of nowhere, I'm going to be outing myself as transgender to, just literally two guys with guns on the side of the road. So it's like a real safety thing, I've thought a lot about it and I figured out how to navigate it. But so this seemed like a big thing. And I wrote an essay about it and I gave it to New York Magazine. I said, this is timely. I would like to see it published as fast as it can. And to their credit, they moved super, super fast on it. I think I got like edits 2 days after I emailed them out of the blue.
Mm.
And yet, in 2 days, in the 2 days that it took me to do it, there was like 5 other extremely cruel executive orders, so that the pace of it was so like breathtaking that like what seemed like my worst problem, I don't know, I don't remember the exact day, but like let's say January 27th or something, and what seemed like the worst problem by January 30th, it was like the passports is the least of the worries, and that speed of just like of losing what kind of rights you have is it's this political problem, but it's also an artistic problem, because I'm trying to write another novel and I'm trying to like gauge like what is, this book is a lot of genre work, but I want to write a realist novel. And when you write a realist novel, you're kind of writing about a little bit like the near future. Like you're trying to write about now, but like now when you write it is actually the near past when you're writing. And so you're kind of like guessing a little bit at the near future. And the kind of paradigm, I guess you'd say, of trans rights in which I was writing suddenly went away. And I'm sitting here, writing, trying to be like, how bad do I have to imagine the future in order to like correctly calibrate what my characters in the near future will be experiencing? Like, is it the type of thing where they are, sort of de facto banned from public because they can't use public spaces? Or is that even going to seem naive? How bad is it going to be worse than that? And meanwhile, if I picture some sort of dystopia, I seem hysterical. But if I don't picture something that's really bad, I can seem like a naive propagandist. And I've been thinking a lot about books. Like I've been thinking about Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, and starting it in 1912, and just like the Germany that he lived in and that he believed. I mean, I think he was a supporter of the German Empire when he started writing that book. And by the time he finished it, I think he made that famous speech like, long live the Republic or something in Germany. And the huge transformation that he had to go through, and also then the like techniques that he had to develop to sort of like write a book that couldn't possibly keep pace with the change. I've been thinking about like somehow he made Magic Mountain where it's like it's 7 years that take place on that mountain, and somehow it's like 1912 for 7 years, and then time catches up, and Kastrop just immediately is machine gunned to death as like time snaps back into the time of the war, and these kinds of questions I think about a lot as an artist. And then there's questions about like, simply how do I actually do the daily work of being an artist in this climate? I'll say one more thing on it, which is that for any trans people that are listening, which is that I even mentioned the passport thing. And when I transitioned, I never thought I was going to get an F in my passport. It was like that was something that Hillary Clinton did, and whereas you didn't even need to change your birth certificate or anything, because some states you can't change it. But that was new in the last 10 years. And so there's a kind of like world of trans people who actually do know how to live in this kind of environment and have made networks. That the idea that you could just walk into I think you should be entitled to. I think everybody should be entitled to walk into a doctor's office and request what they need for bodily autonomy. But there's an entire way of thinking, as an entire history of trans thought, that basically is like authority is only legitimate if they're doing ethical things, and that if people like Trump or whatever authority figures are gonna stop you from doing what you need, then it's entirely legitimate to do what you need, whether that means getting the medicines that you need, whether it means figuring out whatever like mishmash of documents you need, doing whatever you can to sort of make a good life for yourself without needing to be legitimized by authority figures or validated. There's a whole history of that, which is ironic because I think people think that the emphasis on trans language is that like we're constantly running around looking for validity, like please use the right pronouns so I can feel valid. And it's like, actually, I don't care at all what pronouns you use. And I think most trans people, on a matter of just like being polite, it might matter, but it's not going to destroy my sense of self if someone gets that wrong. It's not going to destroy my sense of self if the letter and the gender marker in my passport is wrong. And what really matters in the end, rather than saying any kind of legitimacy from, I would say, illegitimate authority, is just making a life that works. And I'm sort of heartened to see in sort of my circles and the kind of worlds that I run in, like a resurgence of a belief in that, and not only resurgence in the belief, but like a logistical kind of resurgence of like, we're going to live, we're going to do our thing, and you're not going to stop us. And I'm that, as much as I've been sort of like, I wouldn't say that I've been crushed, because I'm not crushed, but as I've been disillusioned, to put it mildly, with this country in the last few weeks, I've also been inspired by the way that people react, and I believe in us.
Well, let me ask you a further question about authority and realism, because
Yeah.
Stag Dance by no means takes place in a safe space. It pushes boundaries, it provokes, and it engages deeply with taboos, which I want to discuss later. But thinking about the executive orders in the real world, I realize one way all these novellas are in a sort of protected space is that the elements at play are not coming from a superstructure coming down upon the characters. There is shame and joy and tenderness and fear and anger as people work out or don't work out who they are. But it seems to me that it's happening in a horizontal plane where that can happen person to person. The structural violence, to me, feels like a subtext that perhaps we as readers bring to the text. But I wondered if that felt right to you.
No, I think that's right. I think it's absolutely the very, very very perceptive. I've always been much more interested in what trans people are doing with each other than what cis authorities are doing. And so the context of my stories are often other trans people. Like, how are we working this out with each other? And that the big obstacles in understanding myself have often been through negotiating what does it mean to be trans, what ideas does some other trans person have that I can borrow, what ideas do they have that I can reject. That's always interested me much more than a kind of like seeking legitimacy from authority, where like, if I sort of make like cis people the enemy or something like that, and I'm just hoping to one day that they won't be mean to me, that also invests them with authority.
Mm-hmm.
I think the basis of a lot of my writing is basically like, I don't really, I love a lot of cis people. I wouldn't even say that I believe that there's a strong binary between cis and trans people. I think that one of the things I'm trying to do in my book is break down the idea that, that we're other to each other, that actually we all kind of have these feelings. But I definitely would not say that like I'm interested in that, like if one day the authority accepted me, all my problems would go away. Like, I don't believe in a world that way. And then I think most of the problems actually come from negotiating, as you say, horizontally with other people. Like, how do I actually make a life with the people I love, even though we're all incredibly frustrating to each other all the time,
Yeah. Well, before we talk about each of the stories on their own terms, I want to spend some time with the book as a whole, because it's 4 novellas written at different points in your life, and to explore what that says about everything from identity to audience and from craft to genre. You make a nod to this macro element in your acknowledgments, where you say you wrote these 4 novellas over a 10-year period to, quote, puzzle out through genre the inconvenient aspects of my never-ending transition, otherwise known as ongoing trans life. So thinking about how presenting these 4 novellas together shows a person in flux in the process of thinking through, and that these novellas are in conversation with each other, I think, because of this. Let's start with the circumstance of the first 2 you wrote, in Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones and The Masker, because how you publish them, and also that you publish them as novellas, arose out of your own assessment of trans representation in literature at the time. 10 years ago. So talk to us a little about the project you started that was the vehicle for these two books, and why and how it started, what need you saw it fulfilling, and what hopes you had for it then when you put them out.
Yeah, I moved from Seattle to Brooklyn to be part of a writing scene that was mostly trans women, but some trans men around Topside Press. And Topside Press was actually started by two trans men, and one of whom I was dating actually. The press kind of had this idea that trans writing in the past had mostly been trying to speak to cis audiences. Had been trying to like convince cis audiences like, hey, we're normal, hey, you should accept us. And the primary and most like popular sort of trans genre was memoir, just a transition memoir, where you say, you know, I used to be X, a boy, a girl, and then I transitioned, and it was a little bit displaying yourself for the like not always prurient, but often prurient sort of viewership or readership. And so these were sort of like, well, what if we did fiction? And what if the fiction was mostly by and for other trans women in the same way that, like, you know, briefly you could think of like Toni Morrison writing for other Black women, sort of similar on a trans level. And what if trans culture or the production of culture is actually between trans people? Like that if you just have one trans person alone amongst a bunch of cis people, that's not really trans culture. That's one trans person. But the culture is sort of the communication that arises between trans people, both in terms of the circulation of literature, but also within literature, trans people talking to each other about ideas. So a lot of the books had a sort of like they called it the topside test instead of the Bechdel test. You know, Bechdel test being, are there two women in a movie talking to each other about something other than men? The topside test was like, are the two trans people in a story talking to each other about something other than medical transition, you know? And there wasn't much that passed that topside test. So the scene was kind of around that. But the problem is that when you have one press, you can't really publish everybody. And it produces a real scarcity mindset. And so the thing that was supposed to be sort of anti-gatekeeping, which was publishing trans books when they were not anything other than memoir, was not getting published by the big presses, itself became a kind of gatekeeper. It's a tremendous amount of work to publish a book, to edit it. So they were doing 3 or 4 a year, and you know who got chosen was highly contested, and all of the normal things that get in the way of publishing got in the way. Like they published mostly white women. It was people that they knew. It wasn't, you know, you had a hard time getting it off of a slush pile. And I never published on Topside, but I had this idea. I lived in with Tom, who was one of the owners and editors and publishers of the press. I lived in his living room, so I could like I lived in, you know, lived with him, but I was always in the living room, and I would see essentially this is how you publish a book. You know, you get Adobe InDesign, you get you know, you find some sort of platform, and you know, you have to learn things like kerning, but you can do it. You know, it's not that hard. And so I had this idea that basically, what if a bunch of trans women, instead of needing a press, we all started publishing our own novellas? And novellas at the time seemed to me like the perfect length. Like you can read it on for like this era. You can read it on the train in an hour. You can write it in a couple of months rather than needing, you know, 3 years, which means that like if your employment is a little bit all over the place, like you just pull it together for a little bit and you can do it. You can self-publish. A novella cost at the time, it cost me about $2.15 to publish each novella. So I could do a print run of a couple hundred for, you know, $500-600 if I could pull that together. And then I could, you know, make a couple bucks on each one, but it wasn't like this huge financial outlay. So the idea was to publish these novellas and get other trans women to publish novellas and kind of create a scene of trading this stuff back and forth. And so I gave them away for free on the internet, or pay what you want on the internet. And they were like $8 for each one. And I would, you know, stuff envelopes and send them in the mail. And then I put my Adobe, I was like, maybe people don't have money to pay for Adobe Suite. So I like tweeted out my Adobe Suite passwords, and Linda, which is classes on how to do like, you know, productivity software. I tweeted out my passwords to that. So anybody could learn, anybody could do it. And I was kind of like, this is going to be a great movement. It's going to be wonderful. And like basically zero people took me up on it.
Mm.
um, because it's actually really hard to publish a book. And a lot of people, even if you're like a weird punk trans woman, you want to publish under the auspices of somebody who will help you get your book into the world, you know? So I was kind of disappointed, and I sort of thought of the project as a failure for the first 2 years, or maybe first year, because other people hadn't weren't doing it the way that I thought they would do it. But meanwhile, these two novellas started to circulate. They were sort of passed hand to hand around Brooklyn, and then these digital copies started getting passed around the internet, and they sort of became like little, like sort of cult objects. And actually, within a couple of years, people did start doing it. They didn't start doing it with my, with my passwords and my ways of doing it in the way that I envisioned, but it happened organically, and people were doing it how they envisioned it instead of, taking up my vision. So I actually do think it sort of worked, just not the way that I thought it would work. And I sort of had thought of them as it was going to be a cycle of five, where I was going to do five novellas, each in a different genre. And I did two, the two you mentioned, and then I started one that I thought was going to be a melodrama, a soap opera, which is a terrible idea because a melodrama, a soap opera is not novella length. It goes on forever. That's the whole point of it. And that one became Detransition Baby. And then after that came out, and basically my life changed. I was doing screenwriting, and I was kind of like, I think I just want to go back to this project because it was actually the happiest I've ever, even
Mm.
though I thought of it as a failure, it was the happiest I've ever been as a writer.
Mm. Well, you've talked about elsewhere how finding your readers first rather than the publishers first, and also a shift within the mainstream culture with trans writers suddenly becoming editors at major magazines, and with shows like Pose and Transparent as part of a new interest and receptivity to trans narratives, that you were approached by an editor from one of the big five publishers for Detransition Baby. It couldn't have been a bigger leap from giving away books for free to this. When you delivered your craft lecture last summer at Tin House Writers Workshop called Strategic Opacity, which has since become a Tin House Live episode on the show, and which is destined to be an all-time favorite, with many people already exclaiming not only how helpful it has been to their writing, but also that they've listened to it many times already. In that conversation, you talk about editorial suggestions that you took for your novel that you now, with retrospect, wish you hadn't. This craft lecture is partially your thinking through why you would respond differently now to those editorial suggestions. And I wondered if you could just speak for a moment about that revelation and regret, and also, given that some of the novellas fall before this feedback and some of them fall after, if you see any way in which that revelation has played out in when you look across the four novellas from that moment of recognition.
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of that craft lecture, it was about Hamlet and Shakespeare, which I realize is like sounds incredible. Like, it was embarrassing to go to Tin House, and which is doing all this progressive stuff, and be like, "Hi, I'm here to talk about Shakespeare." Like the most canon that you could possibly do. But the idea is basically that Hamlet makes no sense. What Hamlet does makes no sense. His stated motivation is that he wants to kill his uncle, and instead of killing his uncle when he could have done it, he pretends to be crazy. Why it's a great play is actually that this reveals his humanity, rather than sort of, I have a goal and the story is about achieving it. I think in the first two novellas, I was very interested in motivation and desire, and especially choice, the way that motivation and desire led to choices. And that's relevant because I was much closer to transition. And that's a really relevant question when you're facing transition, is that you have this feeling you can't quite put your finger on it. I mean, the idea that like, oh, I always knew I was a girl, I think is a little bit like an invention of transition narratives rather than like a reality of how it feels. So, I basically just felt weird. And then it was like, I think I'm going to try to transition. And this choice is going to change everything. And in fact, may ruin my life, and did in a lot of ways kind of ruin my life for a while. So choices were just incredibly present for me. And most of the stories I was writing were about what does it mean to sort of like take agency in your life and make a choice, whether it's in infect your friends and loved ones. I think the main choice in that story is sort of like, should I spread a basically a plague, a contagion that makes everybody else have to make the same choice I did, which is what gender will you be? Or the masker in a sort of like, do I choose the Sally figure who's a transsexual who represents sort of really staid respectability, or do I choose a masker who's a fetishist who's pretty fun? And these kinds of choices were what I was interested in. So because I felt that I lived most of my life in a very stuck way, where it was like, if I can figure this out, this thing, I can make a choice. And even Detransition Baby is in some ways like a very like a biblical choice story, where it's like there's one baby, there's two women who want to be a mother, like it's a King Solomon, like which can you divide the baby in half essentially? Like, can we revise the Bible and maybe divide the baby in half between these two women, which is a bit of a choice as well. So I wrote really thinking a lot about how to not be stuck, how to make choices. And I still care about that. But so much of making a choice is actually about having a character who knows their motivation, in some way. And the more and more I write, I'm sort of like, actually, people make choices and they have no idea what they want. And even when I transitioned, I thought I sort of re-narrativized it as like, oh, I want to be a woman, so I'll transition. But actually, it was like way more murky, and I was stuck because I didn't know, and that many people actually don't know and are doing things that don't really make sense, and that's actually the grand narrative. Otherwise, what you have is a sort of detective story, where it's like something happened and somebody's making a series of choices to like elucidate it, and it turns the reader into like a sort of detective, where you're like, this character wants this thing, let me like go through a bunch of hurdles to see if the character can achieve their want, which is a very screenplay movie way of thinking. And what I began to think about is like, what if a character doesn't really know what they want, and not only that, they're sort of like opaque to themselves, not in a boring way, but in a strategic way, where you can sort of know everything about a character, but make one part of them opaque to themselves, and then see how they do things, which is what I think Shakespeare did with Hamlet. And so only the last story, or only the last story that I wrote in the collection, which is Stag Dance, about a lumberjack who, kind of in a way that I think is sort of opaque to himself, decides to go to a dance where I found this out. This is from real history. Men, they would do the logging camps would be in the middle of the woods, and they'd be there all winter long, because winter is when you can drag the logs. They'd get so lonely, and they'd throw these dances, and they'd dance with each other. And if you wanted to go dance at the dance as a woman, you'd cut out a little triangle of fabric. The symbolism is like way too on the nose, but it'd be like a little brown burlap triangle, like a bush. You'd hang it over your crotch, and that meant you were a woman, and you go to dance. And of course, there was like, they would hook up with each other in the same way that like a lot of, they weren't like, oh, I'm queer or anything. They were lonely, and the way that happens in a lot of like same-sex spaces. So the lumberjack, the babe, who's the main character in the story, who's this giant, ugly, sort of Paul Bunyan-esque lumberjack, kind of makes a decision to wear the triangle to the dance as a woman, and the story kind of follows from there. But I don't explain that desire too much. I like, he describes a little bit like how it feels to decide to want that. But it's not like I have, stories of him as a childhood being like, I always wanted to wear a dress, or like, we don't even really know where he comes from. Like, he's from some, we don't know what his background is too much. And that was a real change, because when I first started writing that story, I had a whole thing where he was a Silesian from parts of the Prussian Empire who was like persecuted and had always been really big, but like what was jealous of his sister's dresses and stuff like that, and then got like sent to the United States, or like they fled to the United States. It was a whole backstory. And it actually to me became much bigger and much more interesting when it wasn't specific, when it was sort of like, these desires are unruly, uncontrollable, and actually can't be contained in backstories or simple narratives. And I sort of discovered it halfway through writing that, and like I said, I cut that whole backstory based on it. But I'm hoping in the future to have like stories where it's like kind of integral from the start. These characters may not totally know themselves, and that you can write with characters who are opaque, and that it's your job as a writer to sort of strategically build everything around to hold their opacity. Because otherwise, a character who doesn't know anything about themselves and is just wandering around for no point, that can be quite boring. I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about Haruki Murakami and like how does he make these aimless characters so compelling? Like, can I borrow from that, and how do you construct around it? But yeah, so that Stag Dance is the one that does it.
Well, just for people who haven't listened to the strategic opacity episode yet, just to name what the revelation was with Detransition Baby, you were asked by editors, why does this trans woman want to be a mother? And you wrote parts of the book that you now regret, explaining it when you've realized ultimately, well, why does any woman want to be a mother? And can you really come up with some sort of like cause and effect of why, some sort of rational explanation of why someone wants to become a mother, when it's often mysterious even to anyone, cis or trans, who wants to be a mother?
Sure, it's like anytime you ask anybody why do you want to be a mom, the answer is always paltry, and less than the act, which is kind of like holy or sacred, and it's like, well, yeah, whatever reason sounds just small.
Well, part of my interest in you including your work over time together, given how you've changed over time, is a selfish interest. But I think my selfish reason might provoke some interesting thoughts on your end. So my agent is out on submission with a manuscript of mine that spans 17 years of my writing. Not all of my writing, it's connected, the writing that's in this, but it is a book that thematically is troubling category and also the impulse to differentiate, mainly across species by disrupting hierarchy. It isn't doing this with gender per se, but I do think of Cal Angus's book, Natural History of Transition,
Yeah.
which also is looking at transness in this broader sense of moving across within the natural world. And my book is also doing this with genre. And the reason I bring this up is in doing deep edits with my agent, I found myself most resistant around accepting edits around my earliest pieces, the most formally normative pieces. Not because I feel most attached to them. It's actually the opposite. I feel most distant from them and also maybe the most insecure about them. I feel like they're the farthest from how I write now. But I think I found myself resistant because I wanted these stories to be there on their own terms, representing me at a different time, as another way of troubling category, of showing a self that contradicts itself, perhaps, or has a different aesthetic.
Yeah.
So showing the same person, but differently, rather than going in and rewriting things how I would write them now. And I bring this up as a preface to asking you about returning to pieces from a decade ago. It isn't as if you haven't ever distanced yourself from past writing before. You've disavowed your 2012 essay, The Cross-Dressing Room,
Yeah.
written before you were out, both because in your words, quote, it was desperately trying to be like, this is normal. You can still love me, everybody. I didn't know why I was writing at the time. I didn't know what writing is for. I didn't know how to be honest. So you still obviously like these two earlier novellas, much as I like my earlier writing. But I wondered if, as you return to them now, how that was, what you noticed in the revisitation, and also if you did edit them, how you edited them, and if that was strange or simple to go into the language or into the narrative with a different sense of, I mean, you've already articulated your different sensibility now.
I guess I think of them a little bit like tattoos. Like if you get a tattoo, you're just sort of marking your body at a particular time in your life, and it's just a memory, like you're just reminding yourself who you were when you got that tattoo. And you have to sort of accept that probably you're gonna think that tattoo is stupid or trite. Or I mean, maybe it's great and reminds you of something. But my tattoos mostly remind me of who I was when I got the tattoo, rather than that I'm like, check out my cool tattoo now. Um, and the tattoos just kind of become a part of you. And by analogy, that's how I feel about these pieces, that they're not the tattoo that I lasered off. Like that Gawker essay that you talk about, like I would go to a tattoo removal person to be like, this is not what I want to identify with or mark myself with. But I look at them and I actually think that they speak to a kind of angst, like a younger angst and a younger kind of like fury that I can't capture right now. Like it's not that I'm not mad sometimes, but I just think that there's a kind of ferocity of youth and frustration, and sometimes it can come across as naive or even sloganistic or something. But I couldn't do it now. Like Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones is just a capsule for that. That's what it. The point of it is a little bit the story, but it's mostly to hold the emotion. When I say what is writing for, like that's what it is. So basically, like this is how it feels like. I'm so, I want to destroy the world. I want everybody to face their gender in the way that I faced it. If you ask me to like sort of vehemently feel that now, like I'm kind of like, well, people are gonna do what they're gonna do, and like it's like it's not like there's no fury. So I couldn't go back to it. I couldn't change it. And I would be just writing something fundamentally different. And I think that like the people who read, the kind of person who that story spoke to, who I talked to, in 2015 or whatever, who wanted to give it to their friends and all that sort of stuff. I can't write for that person anymore, but I still want them to have it. I want them to be able to get it. And in fact, the only editing I did when I published those, novellas, they were riddled with typos because I just am not very good at seeing my own work. And in fact, like some people would complain, but I came to really love the typos, and some of the sentences that are clunky, because I think that at the time I was trying to make a point that I want everybody to write their own novellas. I want them to share their stories, and that you actually, having come from Iowa, where people did write very well, and grad school, I was sort of in a mode of rejecting that. Where I was like, you don't actually need an immaculate page to move people. You actually need the emotions, you need the fury, you need the ferocity. That's what moves people. And whether you spell a word wrong, or if you have a sentence that isn't as elegant as maybe you would have liked, that's fine, because it can be washed over in the actual like honesty or of moving other people, which is what I think writing is actually for, or this is the kind of writing I do. So I had to get rid of all the typos. I made a brief pitch to my editor, like, let's have it be full of typos. And, Random House was like, we have a house style that is not completely messy, and you have to get rid of the typos. So I did correct all the typos in the first two stories. And then the Masker 2, I don't feel the kind of shame. I'm not working through shame now in the way that I was when I was writing the Masker. I don't feel the sort of like when you bring shame into the light and you see that it's actually not that big a deal. Shame is only powerful when you're hiding from it. And like there's this moment you bring it up into the light and you say it's just not that big a deal what I was so ashamed of once you speak it. That feeling of like, oh my God, it's not a big deal and I'm so relieved, that's 10 years in the past for me. So I just don't think I could do it the way that story needed anymore. The Chaser I wrote in 2020, and I seriously revised that one. That one has a totally different ending than I originally wrote, which is not that far away from me, 2020, but it was like a very, very bleak ending. I guess I should have said it based on the Goodreads reviews. There's a scene of animal cruelty, and I should have done a trigger warning or something like that. It was a trigger warning, scene of animal cruelty. These boys sort of act out their own like toxic relationship on a farm with a pig, and where they kill a pig, and it ended there in the original story. And I just was sort of like, I did go back and I was like, this isn't actually what I feel, or like that I don't believe that the story, that when two people are cruel to each other, the story just ends and you just sort of gut punch the audience and walk away and are like, deal with it.
Yeah.
how do you feel now? That actually
Yeah.
that's not the world I believe in. And so I wrote a whole different ending to it to sort of reflect what I think is, you know, what I really was trying to say, which is that the story's from the point of view of like a kind of bro, and that he was in love and he couldn't say the love, and that like actually by not being brave enough to say like I'm in love with this other boy who may actually be a pre-transition trans girl, and I can't tell if this is my love is heterosexual or homosexual, and like this fear around labels is actually preventing me from accessing my love. That everything in his life falls like it's not the scene of cruelty that matters. It's how much you actually lose to hold on to your sense of wanting a future in which you can just be the thing you're supposed to be. The
Yeah.
story ends with him sort of like leaning up against his dad's car, losing love, losing his father's respect, losing everything because he can't admit love, the love that he feels, and that to me felt much truer, and then simply like, well, people are going to be toxic and mean to each other when they do this. Like it's something softer but almost worse.
One thing that piqued my curiosity in your afterword was referring to your never-ending transition, otherwise known as ongoing trans life. I wanted to know more about what the never-endingness means, and we have a question for you from another that feels sort of compatible or kindred to my curiosity, I think. Jamie Hood is a poet, memoirist, and critic. Their debut, How to Be a Good Girl, was a hybrid work of self-making, mingling diary entries, poetry, literary criticism, and love letters to interrogate the archetype of the good girl. Their next book out, March 25th, is Trauma Plot. Because I booked the show super far in advance, sometimes years in advance, every year there are 3 or 4 instances where I feel a pang and actual sort of bodily ache about a book I discover where I wish I could interview them about it. And learning about Trauma Plot is my 2025 anguish so far. So here's Pass Between the Covers guest Kate Sembrino about it. Quote, "This book devastated me. I found my whole being thrumming with the energy of Hood's refusals, her intense thinking and feeling, the formal play with the modernist novel, and her clear-eyed reporting in the wake of trauma. An American Annie Ernaux, Hood writes to avenge her people with incendiary brilliance, wit, pain, and devotion to the search for something like truth." Here's a question for you from Jamie.
Hi, David. Hi, Torrey. Congratulations on Stag Dance. I love this book. I'm so excited for it to be in the world, and I feel really, really honored to be able to engage with your work as both a writer and a friend. So I've read The Masker, The Chaser, and Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones before when you first published them. But I have to say it was a really different experience to read them all at the same time, all in a row, and also alongside the titular novel in the collection. Something that occurred to me was your sense of gender as a spatial or directional formulation. In the author note, you write about transness as movement. You go on to point out that these pieces travel, quote, across genres, across time periods, and yes, across and within genders. I guess I'm just sort of curious if you might talk a bit more about gender in motion, its non-stasis. And if there's time, I'm also really animated by the way Stag Dance foregrounds the erotic in the production or reproduction of gender. Yeah, thank you so much. I hope to see you soon. Love you.
Well, thank you, Jamie. What a surprise to like actually hear your voice right now. Jamie and I have known each other for years, and I agree with you about her book. I think it's going to be really exciting, really a lot of really exciting and hard, but like cool conversations when it comes out. And to answer the question, I guess I do think of it as movement, but I think of it more as like desires and the way that desire causes movement, which is, I think, an Andrea Long Chu formulation, that you want something and you're not sure what it is that you want. And then you go searching for it, and you search for the things that are like available in the world to have it. And I don't just mean that for trans people. I mean that for, I think, everybody's doing it. That, you decide that you want to be seen a certain way, or you want to enact yourself in a certain way, and then you go looking, in the case of like a logger, for instance, you go looking for a flannel shirt and other men to go chop down trees and see your effect in the world and the clearing of the forest. And there's a kind of satisfaction, like a fulfilling of desires as you look upon the work you've done, and that actually then gets called gender, right? Like me and my other men went and cleared the forest, and like that's gender. That's a desire that is fulfilled. And it can be, these desires can change your body. I want to be prettier, and so I went and got a nose job. It could be, that's a very material kind of thing. It can be in who you want to surround yourself with. I wanted to feel this way, and so I went and got a husband who had, I don't know, a homestead, whatever it is, in whatever era. And oftentimes it doesn't meet your desire perfectly, right? It's like, I wanted to feel this way, and I ended up milking cows in Kansas. How did that happen? It didn't quite line up, or only partially did it line up correctly. But I think that the thing about desire is that if you kind of accept it, you can like repress it, which is, I think, what I did for a long time before I transitioned. And so I was like, actually, there was a kind of I felt a kind of stuckness or stasis in my gender, because I was largely just denying the desires that I had, which weren't like sort of like to grow my hair long or like wear a dress or something. Like it was more to like sort of feel parts of me fulfilled, and that I didn't know exactly what they were, but I had to make a series of choices and seek things out in the world, which is sort of the choice thing that I was talking about earlier. But in the book specifically, I think that's what animates most of the motion, is that people have these desires, and that it's very little about identity or gender as a kind of identity marker, like I'm a man, I'm trans, I'm this or that. There's maybe 4 characters in the book who identify as, quote unquote trans. If anything, that the binary that the book is breaking down is not a sort of male female typical idea of gender binary, but a breaking down of like a cis trans binary, where it's kind of like we all have a lot of feelings around who we want to be, and we go out seeking them, and we repress them, or we thwart them, or we twist them in all sorts of different ways as we try to like enact them with other people. Because I think gender is also a negotiation with other people, and that is gender, and that movement of seeking is I think the movement maybe that Jamie is talking about, and that is not unique to transness in any way, other than that transness has provided us trans people with a series of experiences that gives us a lens on how to describe it.
You've perhaps started to answer the next question, but on a conceptual level, and the next person who's going to ask you a question, I think might be leaning more towards the writing level. But as a preface, I just wanted to, in more detail, bring up the setting or scenario of Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones, which is the most, I think, non-linear timeline, leaping into the future and the past on either side of what's called Contagion Day, when a patient zero is created. And it involves a character, Lexi, in a T for T community, a trans for trans community, where love of trans girls is first and foremost. A trans woman who wants to turn a vaccine for pigs into a bioweapon to use on humans, both as an act of revenge, but also to enact her vision of the future, which has utopic elements to it. This pig vaccine, which causes pigs to develop antibodies to their own gonadotropin releasing hormone, the hormone that prompts us to produce our sex hormones. I looked it up, and this is actually a real thing. There's a drug called Improvac that is primarily used to chemically castrate male pigs to avoid what is called boar taint of the meat, which is an unpleasant smell or taste in the meat from male pigs when they've reached puberty. but presumably because it's acting on a precursor hormone, it would have a similar effect on female pigs with regards to sex hormone production and presentation, putting them in a pre-gendered state of sorts. So this utopic vision of the future being trans, defaulting everybody to a place where they're having to make decisions that they normally don't think are choices. This is the most extreme or most overt version of something I think that you do a lot in Stag Dance, which is explore the difference between one's beliefs and one's impulses and desires, and sort of the battle between the two. And this even happens with Lexi's vision, where originally she wants to use this vaccine on the transphobic frat boys who've been terrorizing them, but instead the needle ends up jammed into the arm of an ex-girlfriend she's had a rough falling out with. So as a first step toward discussing this, we have another question for you from novelist Julia Phillips, whose debut, Disappearing Earth, was a National Book Award finalist and was declared a genuine masterpiece by Gary Steingart. Like Disappearing Earth, her second novel, Bear, which came out last year, was both a bestseller and critically acclaimed, with starred reviews left and right and appearing on a lot of Best Book of the Year lists. Meg Hamajumdar says of the book, Bear is the brutal cage of the real world and the magical animal within, a book of untamed, glorious, abundant interpretations. So here's a question from Julia.
Hi, Torrey. This is Julia Phillips. I am a huge fan of yours, and my question for you is, could you talk about how to write ambivalence? Your characters are so often pulled in multiple directions. They hate what they love. They dread what they most desire. I think in the hands of a less skilled writer, this might look like inconsistency, but your characters feel so consistent, perfectly complicated, rich, and real. How do you do that? How do you build out and balance their opposing impulses on the page in order to make them more rounded, more real, more compelling people?
Wow, that's really nice. I've never called it ambivalence to myself. I think that, like, going back to your example of Lexi, where she has this like sort of grand plan to make everybody have to choose their own hormones, the same as trans people do. And then there's like actual life that intervenes in the, and basically your ex-girlfriend's just a bitch and you just can't stand it and you can't control yourself, that the ambivalence to me feels like there's like on different levels. Like I have grand ambitions to do this or that. And then I have my actual petty self, which is, filled with jealousy and competition and all these small things. And it's more like the reason I feel like it's consistent, maybe for the characters, is that's just how I feel about myself, is that like I have these consistent, at least for a period of time, I'm always changing what my vision of myself is, but like how it feels to be inside myself is I have a vision of who I want to be. And then I have like the daily ways that I betray myself, in all these small ways. And that's kind of, I think, the scheme of many of my characters, is that, they have these lofty goals of who they want to be and what they want. And then there's like all the small failings that actually make up who they are. They're short-tempered, they're impatient, they're lazy. I make them sound so charming, my characters. But I think we all are, like,
Yeah.
we lie to ourselves because actually admitting who we are is often very painful. And so you then make an action that's based on a lie to yourself, and that lie then looks inconsistent with your larger goals, but it's actually that you've told yourself a story that it's going to help you reach your larger goals. That, like, the last character in The Masker, for instance, the sissy main character, she betrays herself. I think hers is the worst betrayal in the story, where she sort of has a possibility to make a big change in her life, potentially transition, and she's doesn't do it, I think, ultimately because she's afraid, and that's the biggest thing. But she doesn't want to see herself as somebody who's afraid, and so she makes a horrible decision by convincing herself that it's the appealing decision, not the less frightening decision. And actually, that to me feels totally consistent. That somebody who's lived their life of fear will, even as they want something great, fear will trip them up. I mean, I think that the whole idea of tragic flaws are that the tragic flaws are inherent to a character. That character could only be consistent with those very flaws. And so I'm often looking for the flaws that are of a piece with everything that's like noble and great in a character.
Well, you've talked here and elsewhere just now about how contradictions are what make characters feel human, but you've also talked about your desire to question narratives that overdetermine trans culture. And of course, I think just like contradiction makes both cis and trans characters more interesting, narratives that aren't overdetermined make for better art, whether the characters are cis or trans. But before we take this out to the general case, let's talk specifically about trans representation and overdetermination. Because I think, like with any group that is marginalized and threatened and incredibly underrepresented, where there's a climate of both risk and scarcity, the impulse of the community in its broadest strokes is often to want to put forth a good public-facing face to show one's people in the best light. To me, in these scenarios, it feels like often the pathway away from the overdetermined narrative is also one of breaking taboos within one's own community, and then sometimes suffering blowback for portraying characters in ways that can give ammunition to the enemy. Philip Roth, is one example, faced this really early in his career from the Jewish community, which is really hard to imagine decades later now, given how embraced he is both by the Jewish community and at large. You writing a book with a detransitioned character and with detransition in the title is probably the most prominent example of this in your work. The phenomenon of detransition used as ammunition against trans people and trans rights, which you wanted to reclaim as something the trans community in particular should be writing about, not having it written about primarily in a weaponized way by others. But you also wanted a detransition narrative because it was not familiar to people. It wasn't overdetermined, unlike transition narratives, which had a certain repeated and well-known set of tropes. You also more generally often have your trans characters acting badly, as you've just mentioned. You seem averse to narratives of resilience or of overcoming. And I wonder if that's partly why the book itself isn't presented with the novellas in linear order, in chronological order, that you're not trying to present, well, this is how I've grown, or this is how things have progressed. But not just Lexi vindictively infecting her ex, but in, as you mentioned, the novella The Masker, the main character choosing quote unquote wrong, which perhaps harkens back to the cross-dressing essay that you've since disavowed, where those questions were both alive and unclear for you. But thinking of Julia's question about ambiguity and ambivalence, and also about art and contradiction, but taking it into the realm of the real world of scarcity around community representation, which again, you've nodded to, this is a different situation than 10 years ago around, there isn't a scarcity in the same way, but talk to us about writing taboos and a little more about trans people behaving badly.
I could only write Detransition Baby because I wrote The Masker, which is the last novella in this. And I still think that The Masker is the most dangerous, the most taboo politically thing that I've ever written. Not because it's so shocking, but because of the actual context, which is that historically, basically, the psychiatrist said that there are two types of trans people, or there's actually only one type of trans person, and then there's perverts. There's true transsexuals, who are people who, played with dolls as if they were girls, like played with dolls as they were little kids, wanted to marry men and basically just live their life kind of identically to any cis woman. And then there were basically perverts who just got off on, dressing up in panties and jerking off or whatever, and that they would become transsexuals because they've essentially just taken their perversion too far. This continues to be actually somewhat accepted in psychiatric world. And meanwhile, like all of the medicine that we get through insurance and things like that is predicated on the idea that like we are all real transsexuals suffering from gender dysphoria. And so as a result, sexuality in any way that it manifests in sort of like being trans has been pushed to the side. So like when I was coming out, it was always like, well, there's sexuality and there's gender, and the two are actually separate sort of structures. And people said that not because it was true or that's what they felt, I think, but because admitting sexuality into it opened you up to a realm of psychiatry that would just say that you're a pervert. I mean, this is in the DSM. And so I don't think that that's how it works. I think that people's sexualities are sort of like flashing markers for what they want and how they feel, right? So if you actually want to live your life in a certain way, of course, it's going to show up in your sexuality. And the more you repress it, the more that sexuality is going to come out in extreme ways because you've repressed it. And so you have, sissy culture or online forced feminization where you want somebody to, some powerful person to turn you into a woman. And to me, that's a marker of the fact that you have repressed something and maybe you need to look at yourself. And I'm not saying if you read these stories, you are trans, but like many people who do are trans. Meanwhile, these stories have been seized upon by TERFs and by bigots to basically say that trans women aren't women. They're like perverts who just want to get off on women's clothing and like sort of like want to objectify and like break women down into their component parts as fetish items that they can then like take for themselves. Silence of the Lambs is probably like, a great example of this, where Buffalo Bill skins women and then dances around in like a woman's suit that he's made from women's skins. So this is out there, and this is actually like the reason why trans women get banned from bathrooms, why they're like, you can't be near women's locker rooms, you can't be near children, all these things. Is the idea that like that trans women are just fetishizing women and taking their things on for themselves. And so the masker basically, instead of saying rejecting this, saying no, that's not what's going on. We are actually very respectable people who have no sexuality whatsoever and are totally safe to have in your bathrooms and locker rooms. It kind of says, again, so what? So what? What is this the case? And it's a story of a sissy who basically is shown two options. One is a trans woman who embodies a sort of grotesque level of respectability, like a former cop in a bowling league, and that this respectability is just actually repressing something else. Or you have somebody else who's a female masker who wears a silicone full body suit and is basically like, getting off on your gender is a superpower. Like, why would you ever transition when you can just sort of like dress up like a girl, feel incredibly turned on, and be in pink fog? And the sort of like early transition or maybe very late pre-transition narrator has to choose between these two visions in a very claustrophobic way. And so basically what it's saying is like, you can arrive at being trans through fetishistic stories, through fetish in general. It doesn't mean that you're not trans if you come to it through fetish. That's very politically dangerous. In fact, I fully expect sections, and it has happened in the past, people have found my old versions of the masker, have excerpted things, not attributed as fiction, but attributed to me, Torrey Peters, as saying, saying that like, I can get off on like, violence towards women or whatever thing that, these confused characters say as they're trying to like figure out their desires. And this story has been used politically to basically say trans women are dangerous. It will happen again. It absolutely will happen again by publishing this. But I feel that saying to people who are not transitioning, not living their lives because they think that they're a pervert, or because they've internalized a lot of the stuff, that this doesn't mean you're a pervert, that actually you can be free and you can live your life. And here's a story of somebody who is doing what you're doing now. And look how, let me portray it for you. Let me portray how like actually sad and weird it looks to live in fear of being a pervert, and that can free people through fiction, which is what fiction is like. That's the dream, is to really free people with fiction. I think it's worth it. I'm interested in that taboo. If I wrote a character who is like perfect and great, that's not going to free anybody. Nobody's going to look at a perfect, great character and say, like, yeah, that's my struggle too. I'm also perfect and great. You know, that's not the kind of like hard thing to look at. I mean, you mentioned Philip Roth. Toni Morrison's first book, The Bluest Eye, I think is another example of that
Yeah.
incredibly dangerous book. Black family where the father rapes the daughter, and the daughter's dream is to look white so she can be pretty. I mean, how dangerous was that to say that, to show a character who's so internalized as stuff to basically say that whiteness is prettiness and that black men are dangerous to their children, or this particular, and basically be like, this is actually the context of racism. You can't see how racism destroys a mind, beautiful families, if you just show them overcoming all the time. That's not what it actually does, and you can't recognize that in your own life. And so, and to me, that's books like Philip Roth, like Toni Morrison. That's the amazing thing that fiction can do.
Yeah. I think Bluest Eye is a great comparison.
Yeah.
When this book was announced, you described it as, quote, my evolving attempt to explore the emotional, lived questions at the murky edges of gender that can't be captured by identity categories, the places where we are just people yearning, crashing, loving, and messing up. Again, a reiteration that you are not centering transition narratives, which makes me think about you screenwriting for the Detransition Baby TV series, where you call making that book into a 30-minute comedy sitcom as feeling like the most subversive thing, perhaps similar to setting the book in the first place within the form of a bourgeois family novel. But I also suspect because it would be showing the dailiness of trans people living ordinary lives, going to work, coming home, sitting on the couch, having dinner. But one thing you said at Michigan Quarterly Review about this adaptation, which I wanted to spend a moment with, is, and I'm partially paraphrasing here, so push back if I misspeak, but that you feel like the past decades of arguments about trans representation are actually extremely cis, insofar as they focus on trans representation as if it relates to bodies. You say the controversies about cis people playing trans people in films and the demand that trans actors play trans parts is a regressive argument because it suggests that the only parts for trans people ultimately are playing other trans people. And you suggest as a way to break out of this cycle that we have to consider that, quote, the idea that we're going to look at a person's body, we're going to determine whether or not that body is trans, and then we're going to slot it into roles is actually not how trans people think of their own bodies. My body is in some ways incidental to my experience. It's very important, but it's also like, if I did this surgery and not that surgery, I don't think it makes my body more or less trans. And yet the entire casting process is about the specificity of these bodies. And we have to have the right body for the right role. Well, my question is, how do you visually represent transness in a way that's not all about bodies? Detransition Baby is an interesting problem. Ames is a trans woman who has detransitioned. Do you hire a trans woman but tell her to act like a man? Do you hire a man, then hire a separate trans woman actor to play Amy? Amy being Ames before she transitioned. All in all, these conundrums and this proliferation of questions without answers, it seems to me like it delights you more than it vexes you. But I wondered if it provoked any further thoughts, hearing that back. And also, I'm curious if you have any news about the show, if it's going to get greenlighted or not.
No, it's not going to get greenlighted. I'll just start with the bad news. It was at Amazon, and they fired all the executives post Lord of the Rings, that debacle. They fired all the executives who had bought it and got rid of 95% of the shows in development. It went from like a sort of network that did things like Transparent and Underground Railroad to, just Jack Reacher and NFL. So Detransition Baby didn't fit in with that. And there are a bunch of other like really, Patricia Lockwood had a show there, and I am so sad that show is just so funny. And I for myself, I'm just like, I want to see a Patricia Lockwood show.
I do too.
I mean, the wordplay on that show must have been incredible. Yeah, so it's not going to happen. But, it was interesting. The actual solution that I came up with on that show was that this was before Taylor Swift was like the biggest star in the world. But I wanted Taylor Swift to play Amy, the trans woman version of Ames.
Yeah.
Not because Ames looks like Taylor Swift, but that Taylor Swift is sort of a dysphoric projection of Amy. That in fact, like when you're feeling dysphoria, like when I'm feeling dysphoria and dysmorphia, where I like sort of don't know what my body looks like because I'm so kind of like in my head about it, or I have some sort of dysphoria, or I'm vaguely dissociated. It happens to me less and less, but when I was younger, I would picture myself as somebody else to walk into a room, to basically be like, I'm confident. And so Amy is picturing Taylor Swift to walk into a room every time that she's doing something as a sort of dysphoric projection in which if she's like, I'm Taylor Swift moving around the world, then I can do fine in the world. And so we actually can't ever see Amy visually behind her dysphoric projection of herself, which means if Taylor Swift played Amy, we viewers only ever see Taylor Swift, which is a cis body, or not, which is a cis, she has a cis body, I think. And you could cast a cis woman to play a trans woman if you're talking about how does it actually feel to be in a trans body instead of how does it look to be in a trans body. Like if you can, this is a problem for movies forever, like the gaze. If you can move away from the gaze and be like, what is it like for me to look at a cis woman, and do I enjoy it or not enjoy it, which is often the operative question, is in terms of the gaze. But instead basically be like, that's not actually what's happening. I'm actually seeing what is being felt. Getting around this kind of thing was interesting to me. So I think I wrote that in like 2021, where she was a big ungettable star, and I was kind of like, what you'll actually get is some smaller star. To when the show actually was like up for Amazon, in which they were like, okay, they literally told me, they're like, okay, now go get Taylor Swift. And I was like, what?
Oh
and
God.
I was like, what do you mean? They're like, yeah, well, you wrote the show for Taylor Swift. And I was like, no, I wrote it for like an idea of someone. Like, and they're like, oh, just go call her. And I had like probably like the most humiliating meeting of my life. It was just, like a phone call thing where myself and my producer, she doesn't have an agent. She has like a music manager. And, we managed to get like I don't know how Kevin pulled this up, but we managed to get like a phone call with their music manager. And we basically were like, yeah, we want Taylor. We had to do it because the executives were like, if you don't get Taylor Swift, well, that's what we thought. We thought you were going to have Taylor Swift. And so go get her, and otherwise you don't get a show. And so we like did it and did all this work, get this meeting with the music manager, and we're basically like, yeah, so we want Taylor Swift to play a trans woman who's not really but not actually a trans woman, like the dysphoric projection of a trans woman, on a reoccurring role, but probably only like 2 or 3 episodes, and we don't have much money for it, but like, what do you think? And they were like, well, we've got like $1 billion music tour planned, so I think we don't have the space for it. And they were like, you could just like sort of hear the what the fuck. That to me is sort of like a synecdoche of like my whole time in Hollywood, was just like being put in like vaguely humiliating positions to ask for outrageous things that I was never going to get, because basically nobody understood what I was hoping to do anyway. When the show didn't go on, I was obviously very sad, but like being able to be a novelist again, where if I want Taylor Swift in my novel, I just write Taylor Swift and then write a disclaimer that says all characters are fictional. Much better way to go about doing this kind of thing.
As much as we would have loved to have seen it. Well, part of why I bring this up about bodies versus selves is because I think one of the things that makes your work distinct is your relationship to a different sort of backstory, not the backstory of your strategic opacity talk, not the backstory to explain a character's motivations to a cis reader or cis editor. But I think instead, I guess what I would call the backstory of former selves within what you call ongoing transition, that perhaps there isn't a rival to a static place in your version of a transition narrative. But even if there is a rival, former selves re-echo. And even if they didn't re-echo, it seems you don't want to disown these former selves. I think of the sports scene in Infect Your Friends at a trans beach pride event where the trans woman character feels self-conscious about playing sports because her body would reassume quote unquote male poses. And it feels like it's pointing to the way perhaps that even trans categories can be gender confining. But more I felt, even though it's unspoken and perhaps I'm imagining into this, but it felt like the story was posing a subtextual question, something like, why couldn't these so-called male poses be part of my identity as a trans woman? Or maybe, why do these male poses, which echo a former self, have to be threats to my current self? Or maybe if we are to portray authentic, lived trans experiences, wouldn't it involve portraying moments just like this? In Vulture magazine, you talked about how you didn't know the word trans until you were an adult, that when you were in a Quaker boarding school in Iowa, you had a Facebook page as a boy and another as a girl. You've also talked about later on, when fully out as a trans woman, that at a particularly difficult point in your life, you felt like you needed to either figure out how to detransition and live as a man, or find a way to have a baby as a trans woman and somehow legitimize womanhood this way. You didn't do either, but it's these in-between moments that are, I think, such a big part of these novellas and your novel. The Masker is dedicated, for instance, to my former self at her most afraid. But The Chaser and Stag Dance are also very much stories, I think, like this. In fact, those two are not even necessarily trans stories in the narrow sense of the word. They might be pre-transition stories or intended as such, where characters are puzzling out how they are and how they want to be, but they might not be. They might be queer, cis stories. And it feels indeterminate by design. And it also seems like an open tent for lots of selves to be there at once. And I wonder if this is true. And I also wonder if this aspect is welcome, celebrated, or ruffles feathers within trans discourse. I'd imagine perhaps all of the above, like in any community, but I think of how you've said, for instance, that you like to use the dated term transsexual, which some people find offensive because it has a certain verve. It has a more 70s pulpy exploitation feel, whereas the acceptable transgender feels more like a medical term. And to me, your invitation of all the selves, past and present in these stories, feels like this preference for transsexual. It feels feral and uncontainable in a way. And I wondered, what does that bring up for you?
I mean, I really like it, actually. As you were talking, what I thought a lot about was there's a line in a Julian Barnes story that is like, what a series of discarded selves we are. As you were talking, I thought about that word discarded, that like, as though like you leave a trail of selves behind. And that I actually agree with you. Like I'd always loved that line, but as you were talking, I was like, maybe that line is wrong. Like it's not that I'm just, as though I've discarded them, I can't ever pick them up again. But in fact, like my life is like sort of constantly a question of picking up old selves again. I've been this last year really obsessed with sauna. So I've been building a sauna in the woods. I'm married now. I'm married to a woman. I've dated all sorts of people, but I'm married to a woman. And this last year, I was like in the woods, which is also the sauna thing. The sauna saga also has a lot to do with like why I decided to write about loggers. But I was in the woods by myself, kind of like pleased with my own competence, devoted to one woman, working every day on a construction project. And I, at some point this like that's, I guess it was maybe 2 summers ago, I like thought about myself and I was like, oh my God, I am somehow exactly who my 17-year-old self thought I would be. Pleased with my own stoicism, building things, having a wife, like all of the stuff that I've done, I've ended up some sort of 17-year-old version of myself that my 17-year-old self would recognize. And I was kind of horrified by it. that I was like, I thought I got rid of you or something like that. But in fact, that was who I wanted to be, and that it just comes back in different forms, and that also it less than like who I wanted. It wasn't who I was. Those things are not the problem. It was sort of like how my 17-year-old self would consider those things. And that in fact, like if you go to Vermont, like the woods are full of women who look just like that, this idea of like a sort of like a stoic American man. I had sort of believed that that's the only person who could do this kind of thing. But there is like still like a former self there, like all the way through it. And that's kind of like a lot of my experience is trying to discard a self and then discovering that I haven't done a complete enough job, and then in fact this discarded self is who accidentally is like, been stuck to my shoe like toilet paper or something is actually beautiful, and I love it, and I want to pick it up and caress it or something. Yeah, that's very much an experience that I feel. And it's interesting that you connect this also to bodies, because I also think I a little bit contradict myself in the stories when it comes to bodies. Like the taboo, I think, in the Stag Dance novella is, I started thinking about that because somebody asked me in Detransition Baby, like, why did I always write, sort of normatively attractive characters, and I began to think like, oh, it actually has to do with like a certain frictionlessness with ideas of transition, and that a lot of that is actually about like sort of like what would the word be, like the proper trans version of telling a story about transition, which is that like, and I think the Masker makes this argument. The idea is that like it actually doesn't matter what your body is. If you feel a certain way, you can make a choice and you can change it. And I think that's the sort of standard rousing kind of slogan that you can find on Twitter and stuff. And it actually is like, I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true at all. I think that you get a body and it's like incredibly unfair, but your body also determines what you're able to convince other people you are. Not what you actually are on the inside, but what you're able to convince other people you are. And the gender is oftentimes a negotiation, not with like what is just inside of you, but in what other people are willing to like give you credit for. Mm-hmm. And so, why do I have long hair? Why do I, wear the clothes that I wear? Well, it's partially so that other people will give me credit for what I want. It's not that I need to do that to like affirm something in myself. It's so that other people will affirm it and I can kind of exist in communication with other people. And the fact is that some people's bodies prohibit them from easily doing that. So the logger, who's like a Paul Bunyan-esque, huge, ugly, strong character, I use the word felicitous, I think, in the afterwards, where I think about like, is your transition felicitous? And I mean that in a sort of like Austinian speech act sense, like if you make a declaration, do people accept it as felicitous? Or are they sort of like, no, like classically, like if I say, I now pronounce you married, if you're a priest, that is a felicitous statement. If I say, I now pronounce you married as me, nobody's like, I'm not married because Torrey said so. So if I say I'm a woman, if I have a body that sort of like underwrites that or ratifies it, then people are like, oh yeah, she's a woman. And if I don't have the right body, then they're like, no, she's not a woman, or he's not a woman. And so the logger, the babe in this, is somebody whose body never allows that character to sort of ratify the declaration of I'm a woman. And the twink kind of character in the story that the babe is jealous of is somebody whose body is so felicitous with that like it's sort of like all of the other loggers are just like eager to sort of ratify a gender change. Like, we want this character to be a pretty woman so that we can dance with the pretty woman. So we're like, the character has to basically do nothing for everybody to do this. And like in the terms of the language, like the Leeson character, who's the pretty character who has a body that produces a felicity with this, the pronouns change in the language of the story for that character. The pronouns for the babe never change because basically even the story isn't willing to negotiate with this character because of bodies. And that's a really that was a really ugly thing for me to write, because I'm gonna have readers who feel that way, and they're like, oh well, what is Torrey rubbing it in my face? Like, what is this? This is just cruel. And for me, I think it's actually about acknowledging like how this stuff works, and how I, as a negotiator, like pretending that everybody can just do it is actually a kind of lie that makes other people's lives harder. If I just say, hey, all you have to do is declare it and then you're done, then you can say something like, well, does it matter what kind of body you have? Like a lot of sort of like really progressive arguments that are sort of like anybody can wear whatever clothes they want. Anybody can do this sort of thing. I'm like, that's great in theory. And I would love to live in a society where the society was willing to negotiate with people about that. But actually, the society is constantly negotiating with our bodies as they are. And so, because society is negotiating with our bodies as they are, it really helps to have things like access to estrogen. It really helps to have like medical care. It really helps to have therapy to deal with this kind of stuff. And that, because I don't think the society is totally going to change, that tends to be the kind of thing that I think is desperately important. And because it's actually such a difficult thing to write, it's the type of thing that I would only ever show in fiction through this character. I would never say to somebody, your body's infelicitous for transition. How could I say that? Like, I hate to even hear that out of my mouth right now. But also pretending that that stuff doesn't exist produces misery for people, I think.
Well, I want to talk more about how your work engages with cisness in relation to transness. But before we do, I was hoping we could hear the opening to my favorite novella, The Chaser, if you have the book nearby.
Yeah, let me grab it. When I read The Chaser, I kind of do the bro voice.
Okay,
So
great.
Apologies to that.
So if Detransition Baby is a domestic family drama, Infect Your Friends is sci-fi, and The Masker is horror, this, I think, would be teen romance, perhaps.
Yeah, teen romance. I think of it as sort of like a little bit like in the tradition of like A Separate Piece, or a little bit like Brideshead Revisited or something like that. I mean, that's like the sort of highfalutin version of it. Another version of it might just be like Twilight, where, one character is kind of like enamored of another, and all like the teenage angst that entails. Okay, so great. The reason that Robbie had a slight odor, like leaves decaying in the fall, is that he didn't shower. He didn't shower because the boys' dorm had only a gang shower, a beige-tiled room with 4 shower heads poking out from the wall. Robbie hated getting naked in front of the other boys, for anyone to see his chubby feminine body and his tiny cock. I didn't like the gang shower either when I first got there. It seemed like some weird holdover from the 1950s, something that should have been modernized after the sex panics the society had gone through when it realized that boys could be molested too. But nope, the Quakers never got the memo. Probably thought it builds character. Back in the suburbs, my friends would have called our shower rooms super gay, all of us soaping up in front of one another. But that's not how things were at boarding school. The homo thing was to be afraid of looking at each other's bodies. The hetero thing was to just dangle your dick out while talking to each other, acting like you couldn't care less about the other dicks pointing back at you. And then, even to outman one another, we would just be naked all the time. This one kid, Kyle, he took the shower head off the pipe so the water came out in a hard stream like from a fire hose, and he'd wash his asshole in front of us with the same chill that he brushed his teeth. We all started doing it. We called it the power shower. If you wanted to show that you weren't homo, just get that power shower up your ass in front of the other dudes. It was this weird posturing, and it was effective. I respected Kyle. He worked out, he listened to hip hop, and he washed his ass with the equivalent of a pressure washer like it was no big deal. Weird flex, but still, impressive flex. There was only one toilet stall that had a door. It was suspect if you took a shit in that stall. If a kid was in there, other kids wouldn't let him shit in peace. What are you hiding, bro? You jerking off in there? We had this one toilet by the window. Some kids destroyed the entire stall around it. So to punish us, the head of the boys' dorm refused to fix it. We called that toilet the throne because upon it you could hold court, surveying the entire dominion of the bathroom while you shat. And not only did it occupy the position of prominence within the bathroom, it was right next to the window. So to show off, you could lean out and call to any girls that were in the school square as you plopped in the water. That was the alpha move, the confidence to shit like you weren't shitting at all. Anyway, I got placed with Robbie as my roommate in the fall semester of my junior year. He had to ditch class so he could shower when no one else would be around. He'd get detention, but the trade-off was worth it to him for the occasional shower in peace. Early on, I tried to explain to him that if he didn't want anyone to think he was a fag, he had to just not care what we thought about his body. But of course, he didn't necessarily want us to think he wasn't a fag. Not only did he care what boys thought of his body, some part of him wanted boys to notice his body, even if he couldn't quite bring himself to say that. That's how it is for girls too, I think. They want us to notice their bodies, to obsess about their bodies, and that's why they can't show them to us. A power washer up the ass might ruin the allure.
Been listening to Torrey Peters read the story, the novella The Chaser, from her new book, Stag Dance. So when we receive advanced reader copies as media people, sometimes there's an extra page at the beginning that is a letter addressed to us. Sometimes that letter is by the editor. Sometimes, like with Stag Dance, it's from the author herself. In yours, you say something that you've mentioned early on in our conversation today. Quote, "Almost everything I read about transness seeks to complicate, destabilize, or even break down the binary between male and female, masculinity and femininity, men and women. That's all well and good, but to be honest, after Detransition Baby, I felt less invested in exploring those distinctions. What interests me, what has always interested me, is the binary between cis and trans. Where is the line? Is it even a binary?" And then later on you say, "Stag Dance is my attempt to explore the emotional, lived questions the binary between cis and trans provokes, to feel around in the murky and taboo edges of transness where it's not even clear what transness or cisness even is, where imperfect politics and ultra-sexuality lurk. In a way, I feel like you are Lexi's best self, the one who declares the future will be trans, who wants to default everyone to a genderless state, cis and trans people alike, to see what we discover about ourselves when all the options are on the table. That surely some significant portion of people would discover that absent the limited options given to them based on their bodies or societal expectations or from fear or shame, that they would choose differently if all of this were removed and you had to build how you wanted to present and what gender you were from scratch. Some examples that come to mind in your narratives and interviews of yours include the story you just read from, where Robbie, with his chubby feminine body and small penis, he's having an affair with his bunk bed mate, but only in the dark at night because his bunk mate sees himself as cishet and in the daytime treats Robbie poorly. But later when they're doing a work study on a farm, it's the roommate who can't handle castrating the pigs or even seeing it, who can't do many of the hard chores on the farm either. And Robbie, who's super capable in these masculine coded activities. The context has shifted their roles. And unlike the dedication in The Masker, another example would be the dedication in Detransition Baby to divorced cis women, because you found some parallels in the transition narrative between trans and cis people and what divorced women go through. Likewise, you've said you used to think cis women had gender figured out and have since realized everyone is failing at gender. In that spirit, you've called the Kardashians female-to-female transsexuals, which I definitely want to hear more about. You've looked to Ferrante and Knausgaard for inspiration and for their own performances of gender, even asking to be on the Knausgaard specific podcast as a guest. And it was there where you mentioned having been accused of being assimilationist, which perhaps relates to this impulse not towards separatism, but towards solidarity. Lastly, I'll mention this last thing, I think, because I feel like it's different than assimilation, what you're going for. But you often mention the sci-fi writer Joanna Russ's stages for marginalized literature, which you've characterized as the first stage, we are just like you, accept us. The second stage, fuck off, we are nothing like you, we reject you. And the third stage, we are neither like you or reject you, we have our own thing and we don't need you. But you suggest a fourth phase, which feels like it pertains to the cis-trans binary exploration you're doing. And I was hoping maybe you could just, in your own words, present the fourth phase to us and any other thoughts that you have from what I just read back to you.
Sure. The fourth phase would be where the dominant group picks up the lens of the marginalized group and starts applying it to themselves. So, in the case of like race, whiteness used to be sort of invisible, and then eventually you had critical race theory and all these kind of things, which of course people are trying to stamp out now. But what that did is it revealed the fact that white people have a race too, and are using it. In fact, I think it was the realization that white people had that they have a race that has so scared them that they are actually subject to this terrible regime that has been created. And same for a lot of versions of gender, not in a trans way, but like, the rise of the manosphere and things like that, where the kind of like, oh, what gender you have actually makes a huge difference in your access to things. So now let's claim that men are oppressed, and I don't want to be so dismissive of that particular thing, because I think a lot of men in this country are very upset and sad, but the idea of them as sort of like the oppressed group seems to actually have come out of feminism, and uses a lot of feminist arguments. And then lastly, now I think it's happening with trans stuff, where people are sort of like, oh my God, my gender is not like an innate thing to me, but is a series of choices that I've made. That's kind of where I say like the sort of female to female transsexual of the Kardashians, which is not to knock the Kardashians, but to simply say that I think you had someone like Kim Kardashian or any of them basically be like, I have this body, I have this way of being, and I want to be more on a gender continuum. I want to move on the gender continuum. And so I'm going to move towards more feminine. And in fact, the distance that the Kardashians have moved from sort of feminine to really feminine, and the work that they put into it, is probably a further distance that they've traversed than the distance that I've traversed. It's just that I crossed an imaginary boundary of like male female. I did a whole talk in Oslo actually about Hemingway, and like Hemingway's moving from just sort of like a midwestern boy to this ultra masculinity that he did, where he had to shoot the buffaloes. He had to punch any guy who came to Key West. He had to like, when he got in an airplane crash, he couldn't just like kick out the door. He had to headbutt his way through the door, like the way it was very much a self-conscious performance that he sort of trapped himself in. The Garden of Eden is like his last book. There's like 2,000 pages. I mean, there's all this trans stuff actually that like it's almost like he couldn't hide the fact that this stuff is all performance. So that you read Garden of Eden, and he and his wife in the book call each other by each other's names in bed. He wants her to cut her hair short. He wants to be her girl and stuff like that. Where I'm not saying that Hemingway was trans. I think it's sort of like his performance of performing masculinity to become it revealed to him how flimsy and arbitrary this stuff is, how it's not fixed. And that like he almost couldn't hide that from himself at the end. And it was his posthumous editors who cut 1,200 pages or whatever of his writings about feeling like a girl sometimes from the book. And I kind of think we all have this. We all can move around, and trans people simply reveal that it's the movement that matters rather than where you particularly move across some sort of like politically marked DMZ zone.
But to see if I understand this correctly, to connect the Hemingway anecdote to the fourth stage of Joanna Russ that you're proposing, are you saying essentially sort of similar to the way white people now understand themselves through the terms of Black scholarship, and similarly straight people understand themselves a lot through the language of queer culture? Are you also saying then essentially like Hemingway was understanding something at the time that maybe now what trans literature is doing would have provided him with a language to understand it even better?
Yes. I mean, the Hemingway example is anachronistic, which makes it, which now that you say it is a little bit confusing to your question. First of all, I agree exactly with what you said. I think you said it perfectly, and I don't need to restate what you just said. I think that's correct. But I also think a lot of ultra masculine writers reinvent the wheel that trans people have invented. That's why I'm interested in Knausgaard. Knausgaard sort of reinvented everything that trans people discovered for himself in this book because he refused to read any trans or queer. I actually had an interview with him and I asked him,
Oh, wow.
yeah, New York Magazine. And I said, here's all the things you say about gender and how you actually feel really that your gender is very fluid and open, but that you had to pretend to be a man because that would make your life better. It seems very much like what trans people are saying. Have you ever read any trans books? And he was like, no, like flat out.
Huh.
And he's like, no, I just had to sort of like discover it. And that I think is the point. Like Hemingway did enough gender performance that he was like, oh, actually, this stuff is totally arbitrary. He kind of reinvented a wheel. And Knausgaard did it. And it would have been nicer for them if reading trans books hadn't been such a threat to their gender that they couldn't have just added to the conversation that's already happening instead of sort of reinventing it in their own cul-de-sac. Even as I kind of admire the fact that they did discover it, you know,
Yeah.
because I don't think it's something that you discover from being trans. I think it's something that you discover from living. And I admire them for at least being honest about that.
Yeah. Well, as a sort of a step towards talking a little bit more about Stag Dance, the novel or novella that is the biggest part of this book, and also the one most significantly written after Detransition Baby, I wanted to ask you a question about audience. When talking about not writing truthfully when you were at Iowa, you've also talked about how later you were invited to be part of a Topside Press reading tour where you would be reading in front of other trans women, principally. How all of a sudden you couldn't write something like, I'm a cross-dresser, I know I'm ridiculous, you can still trust me, because saying I am ridiculous is calling your audience ridiculous. How this experience was super clarifying for you early on. You've also talked about how after your first two novellas, written for a very defined and small audience of trans women, you couldn't have imagined how big Detransition Baby was ultimately going to be. Not only a huge domestic audience, but translated into French, German, Spanish, Italian, Dutch, Polish, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Chinese, and more. And you say in your strategic opacity talk that when you imagined your audience as a handful of people, and when your audience was in fact a smaller audience, you could say things without a fear of what you were saying. And that you were worried now you might self-censor given how big the stage is. So I just wanted to bring that up, thinking about the novella Stag Dance, written after this worry was produced in you by this new type of audience. How have or haven't those fears manifested and or been overcome, or were they there at all as you wrote Stag Dance?
I think Stag Dance is totally a reaction to Detransition Baby and to the reception of Detransition Baby. But it's like a perverse reaction. It's like very much my personality that I wrote this domestic romance kind of for like the women's market. And, the thing that most people wanted me to do to follow up was to write something else like that because it sold a lot of copies. And instead, I wrote a logger story about an ugly man who, in a made up and difficult vernacular, living in a forest amongst the refuse and piss and shit of all of the loggers. Like that is just not glamorous. It's not Sex in the City. And I think the storytelling mode is totally different too. And I think it was like kind of wanting to get away from the conversations that Detransition Baby produced and see something new that led me to do that. In terms of audience, I kind of was like, I have no idea if my audience will follow me. I have no idea if trans people will want to read this because it's not like a clearly trans story. And I have no idea if I did like book clubs in Indiana, with like a lot of moms and stuff who could relate to like the questions of motherhood and femininity and Detransition Baby. I have no idea if they'll want to follow me or if they'll just be like, this is weird. I think I had to do something like that to kind of free myself a little bit, to to basically be like, well, what do I really care about? You know, like I'm not a writer who's like, I don't give a shit about my audience. Like even as we're talking this podcast where they sound like dark and like, you know, like full of angst and that sort of thing. I'm very attuned to like, I want to give you jokes. I want to give you plot. I want to give you like moments, you know, and if you're going to come with me on these journeys, I'm going to try and indulge you and show you a good time with these stories. That's really important to me. But I don't know if that audience will think that this is a good time. But I sort of had to do it to basically be like, well, what do I really think is a good time? Not just in that negotiation with the audience. And so I don't know if I'll write anything like Stag Dance ever again. I think it was just like it was a thing I kind of had to write to find a certain like freedom and to do something new. So audience had a lot to do with it, but it was almost like a perverse kind of like, let me challenge my audience or change how my audience thinks of this stuff as much as it was like in the past, I'd been very much with trans audiences, like, let me give you something to relate to. I almost think that this was different. And it was like, let me give you something that maybe you'll disidentify with.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, as a lead in to a question from another about this story, I was hoping we could hear a paragraph from it. I was thinking the first paragraph on 122, just simply as an example of how this story is a departure from everything else you've written in terms of syntax and vocabulary. The sentences are very different, and there's like an entirely different music and density to the way that the prose is.
I read this to myself in a lumberjack voice. So again, it's just like sort of to try and capture the cadence, and I'll try and do it. But like when I was writing it, I was like talking in this ridiculous voice. That is how I found usually it was just by ear. Does it sound right to me? Can I actually read my favorite paragraph?
Yeah, no, if you want to read, read whatever you want to read.
I'll read one that is my favorite, like just kind of like just chewy words, if it's okay.
That's great.
Yeah, okay. So this is just to set it up for the things that this is the first time he sees the brown triangle that he decides that he wants to wear to the dance. So they're trying to make Leeson, the pretty boy in camp, wear the brown triangle and go to the camp as a girl. And Babe, the lumberjack, steps out to stop them and say that actually, I'm going to take the triangle and I want to wear it myself. Give it here, I said, meaning the bush triangle. I want to wear it. Brunswick Bob and Stub Nelson startled and twirled round to face me. No one had seen or heard my arrival when I stepped out from the spruce. Mickles wasn't so easily flustered. He showed no shame and kept his eyes on Leeson, then slowly raised himself to deal with me. Who, you? Mickles asked. He dangled the triangle before me as though it were something slimy and repellent, some rotted vermin pulled from the shoe by the tail. You want this? Honest truth, I did want it. In fact, I'd have to admit that I'd wanted to wear the bush since I saw it pinched between Daglish's legs at breakfast. When the works or bets hadn't occupied me, I'd been turning over in my mind how to play volunteer, how to land it as a joke on the one hand, yet it seemed such time not a joke at all, because despite myself, I had many times wondered in earnest about being courted as a woman is courted. This, too, seemed one of God's attempts at humor, a desire unbidden by me, unspoken and flummoxing to me, a desire that, without my desiring it too, made itself manifest in sessions of feverish blanketed self-abuse, and that now against all odds presented itself to me in the tantalizing possibility of a brown fabric triangle. The Babe wants to be a scooch for the Stag. Brunswick Bob was incredulous. Who could even dip you? You think I'm not pretty enough for the bush? I lifted my voice in the manner of a flirt to disconcert them, and also to conceal my pain at Brunswick Bob having used my nickname, which Brunswick Bob knew I greatly disliked because I had on occasion told him how much I greatly disliked it. Well now, Stub Nelson began, but then he shoved one remaining hand into his wax coat and didn't dare share the rest of his thought. Brunswick Bob adjusted his Copenhagen and bent forward to leak brown juice between his front teeth, but that was the extent of his input. Of course, we all knew I wasn't pretty enough for it, nowhere close to it, Leeson. Famously the opposite. My face was all rough-hewn pituitary exuberance. You could set a beer glass on my brow shelf, a wedge of nose dog-legged and wrinkled at the top and bottom from having been jammed into a space that couldn't fully accommodate it. I had no true features as such, only protrusions and shadow-shaped recesses in which hid my eyes and lips as eels lurk within dank holes. My knuckles, both finger and toe, sprouted brown tufts, and children could use my shoes for sleds. no mirror had ever befriended me.
Well, I love this story as a story, but I also love being in this different vernacular, one that made me go run to look up different seemingly made up things, only to be delighted that they were actual real lumberjack vocabulary, like cackleberries as slang for eggs or monkey blankets for pancakes. But thinking about how this is not only a period piece with a real historical setting of sorts, but also a very specialized one, a very unique community with its own circumstances, customs, vocabulary, and more. And even though that I know that you and your partner, as you've mentioned, have an off-grid cabin in Vermont and have been documenting your construction of the sauna on Instagram, this really gorgeous looking space where you can then go plunge into this amazing river. And even though it's clear you're comfortable with power tools, axes, driving a tractor, and more, even with all that, I imagine it required more of you than pure imagination and lived experience to write this story in particular, which is what this question is about. From two-time Past Between the Covers guest, Carmen Maria Machado, author of the two incredible books, In the Dream House and Her Body and Other Parties. Here's a question for you from Carmen.
Hi, Torrey. This is Carmen Maria Machado. I have a question for you about research. The title story of the collection, Stag Dance, is obviously very firmly set in history. And I was wondering what your research process looked like and how you sort of turned what you learned into what you wrote. I am working on some historical material right now, and this is sort of my biggest challenge, is trying to bridge between the two. So I was just wondering, what that looked like for you. Can't wait to hear your answer.
Thank you, Carmen. And also, I didn't thank Julia earlier for her question. Both I'm really grateful for, and also like admire all these writers that you're getting to ask me questions. Is really quite a lineup. For me, this book started out with this character, started out mostly through cadence. Like that's kind of why I wanted to read that last section. There's a kind of like, I don't know, a particular cadence to like the voice that I found, which I found that before everything else. And it sounds to me a little bit like this like Americana voice that I hear in like books like True Grit or a little bit like Confederacy of Dunces. Like it's a comic voice, but also like a chewy voice, and like it doubles back on itself a lot. It states the obvious a lot. And yeah, there's like a chunkity 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 sound to it. I found that. And then I started filling in words. And the way I found the words was, I think the way a lot of research kind of starts with, I just found lumberjack slang on the internet. And then eventually I was like, that's not enough. And I found a book called Lumberjack Lingo. It was written in 1942, I think. And it was a guy collecting the slang that his father and his father's friends had used in like 1915 type era, mostly in Wisconsin rather than the West, mostly in sort of Minnesota, Wisconsin, woods areas. And then that slang kind of moved west as people, as the woods were all cut down and people had to move west. And then that was fine. But then I was like, I actually can't picture most of these tools. Like it would be like, it'd be like, this is the cant pole. And then I'd be like, what's a cant pole? And it'd be like a short-handled PV. And you're like, what? Like, I don't know what a and then they'd be like, what's a short-handled PV? And they'd be like, like a kill stick or something. And then it's like, there's no like starting place to understand it. And so I found a bunch of film documentaries of lumberjack stuff. I started just looking at actually like documentaries of mills at the time. There'd be like documentaries of how to saw logs at mills. And it was like I had to see it. I had to see like, okay, because they say, oh, we're hanging it's on the high line or something like that. It's like, what's a high line? And it was actually like they strung a cable from peak to peak on tall poles, and they would sort of drag a log in the air hanging above the forest rather than dragging along the ground. They started dragging along the ground, and then they started setting up on poles, I couldn't picture it from the descriptions. I had to actually see what it looked like. And then, and then I read books and this kind of the usual stuff. And then I got to a point where I was basically like, okay, most of the books I really love, actually, they understand the stuff and then they sort of just start making things up. Like I think about something like Cormac McCarthy, where, okay, here's Blood Meridian. Well, actually, nobody talks in like King James, King James cadence on the frontier. The stuff that the judge knew was oftentimes anachronistic. It was just like, but to create this like sort of larger than life war god thing is like you have to leave it. And I think this is also a tradition of it, going back to something like Moby Dick, like these disquisitions on whaling and all these things, and like, well, why does Ishmael know this, or like all these things are broken, and I kind of was like, well, I want to also start breaking some stuff with this. One thing I did is I eventually sort of got interested in sort of mythic tall tale time as opposed to actual time. So it's set in sort of like a mythic tall tale Paul Bunyan time, rather than like the actual time. It probably would be like the period of transition between horse-drawn logging and steam logging, which you could date to, like, depending where and how much the technology had penetrated, the turn of the century to about 1915. But I was less interested in that than in it being accurate than sort of like what is fun from both the era of horses and the era of steam engines, and can I kind of just do a mashup that feels that way. I cut out a lot of the racist stuff in the logging language. I didn't even realize, like, they had a word, klooch, that was the word for sort of like, you could say it was sort of like beau, my girl, my squeeze, sort of, and they would also use it for young pretty boys on the camp and stuff, which the other word for that was punk. But the klooch was really mostly for like women that you were hooking up with. And that word had a great sound to it. And then I finished the whole book and gave it to one of my friends, and my friend was like, that's actually like a derogatory word for an indigenous woman that you like took to be your woman and are sleeping with. And I was like, I'm not trying to be historically correct in a way that I just don't need to do it, and didn't feel good. And so, I created other words that meant what I wanted them to mean. And I wasn't trying to like sanitize the past. Anyone who wants to find out the way that like loggers were, logging in the West was Manifest Destiny, all that stuff was a colonial project. I think there's plenty of stuff out there. I really wanted to create a feel. And I also just think that like sometimes there's certain language that like I know as a trans woman that like if it's deployed wrong, it might be accurate. People might say it, but it's like, it's just not what I wanted to run into in that moment, And so there were things in what loggers did where I was like, I don't really want to run into this at this moment here, and there were a lot of choices that I made in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes just changing things, sometimes making it more fun or more open. And it really got good when I granted myself the ability to a little bit change the past rather than just research it.
As we come to an end, the way I was going to ask a final question, given that this feels both more historical than your other work, and at the same time, as you've said, more like a tall tale and a fable than your other work, sort of both more real and more unreal, I think. And given its chewy syntax that's so different than from our own, I'm just going to read it another couple lines. The wicker and whinnies of hay burners bedded in from the wind, pipe tobacco smoke from the corn cobs, the metronome spit of Scandinavian dynamite into a tin mug, the splitting and carrying of a night's wood into the cougar den where we all crammed in for sleep. It's very different, the meter and everything of this. I was going to ask you, does this hint at a new direction for you? But you've already answered that, given that this is almost like a response to what came before in order to create a break to clear the deck. As part of that, I'll just mention that in another interview when I was looking at your interviews from the past, but from 4 years ago with Carter Sickles, you did mention that you were working on a queer financial thriller at the time, influenced by Ayad Akhtar's Homeland Elegies, a book I also loved. and for which he came on the show to discuss. And you said then that you found his way of talking about money and identity useful for you and talking about trans lives. Is that a book still in the works? And either way, how do you feel post Stag Dance in terms of of animating questions or the edge that puts you on in terms of where you might want to go now, either on the level of the sentence or in the level of story or genre?
I mean, writing a book that has to do with like political economy in terms of trans people is like my white whale. Like it's the thing that like I don't know how to do it. I think it will require like a real step up in skill. I'm thinking by political economy, I mean a book like Wolf Hall or something like that, where you've got a character whose choices are really conditioned by culture, by money, and like the flows of money, by the beliefs of the people around them, and that it's a person having a certain kind of agency, but within like a very, very clear context in which you can kind of see political power and money flowing. And we started out this show talking about the executive orders. Like right now, I see strange money, strange politics all flowing around me and conditioning my life. And I see the ways that could like push trans culture in certain ways, both in reaction to it, or for instance, like you see kind of strange tech, neoliberal tech gender startups where it's like, we're going to sell you on the internet, your gender, kind of things. And that all of this stuff can be co-opted, it can be manipulated, and much of it, even something that seemed like hard, like money, seems flexible and alien to me now. So the Ayat Akhtar's Homeland Elegy is talking about like money and Islam and American identity, all those things. And the way that I kind of connected to like earlier books like Great Gatsby, it was interesting to me. I think what I'm actually trying to do is like very different than what he's trying to do, or what he achieved, I guess I should say. But I also don't know how to do it yet. Like I don't know. I think that something like Stag Dance was like, whether people like it or not, like it definitely felt to me like a level up in my skill. Like, okay, can I actually create a character who's really different than me, who talks really differently, and can I make this character feel like that character has a consciousness that is quite different than my own? That was something I needed to be able to do for the projects that I want to do in the future. And I'm kind of hoping that in May or June, so I've been spending a lot of time in Colombia. I'm getting my Colombian residency. That I'm just going to go to Colombia and try and figure out how to become the kind of writer who can write the book that I see the outlines of it in my head, but I can't write it yet. Like I have to become that. I have to become somehow that writer who can write that book, which is a little bit different project than writing the book once you are the writer who can write that book.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for being on the show today, Torrey.
Thank you so much for these questions and for your thoughtfulness and completeness. It feels like such an honor to be interviewed this way, and I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Likewise.
I mean, quite genuinely, like your questions are terrific, and I feel that I'm a little bit of a low affect person, but I'm incredibly stimulated by the things you're asking, and it's like very, it's great to be able to like talk about my ideas at length and to feel, really engaged with the entire time. So I truly, I'm buzzing. I'm really happy.
Thank you. That means a lot to me.
Yeah, it's true. Like an interview that makes me feel good is a really different thing than an interview. And I can feel it in interviews. Like I feel like there's times where like I think when you're an author in your book, that you can start by kind of giving prepackaged answers, like you start paragraphs that you've memorized, and that like certain interviewers like. You just get engaged and you break out of that and you start saying things that like, I mean, you had insights that, there are things that I said that like, oh, I didn't actually know that I felt that until you asked me in this way, Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I've been talking today to Torrey Peters, the author of Stag Dance. If you're listening to Between the Covers, I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. You can find more of Torrey Peters' work at torreypeters.com. For the bonus audio archive, Torrey contributes a reading of the first thing she wrote after transitioning, a zine called How to Become a Really, Really Not Famous Trans Lady Writer, which she reads for us in its entirety, all 20 steps. This joins bonus audio from everyone from Carmen Maria Machado to Garth Greenwell to C.A. Conrad. The bonus audio is only one possible thing to choose from if you join the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives the supplementary resources with every conversation of things I discovered while preparing, things referenced during the conversation, and places to explore once you're done listening. There's also the Tin House Early Readership subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public, rare collectibles from past guests, and a bundle of books selected and curated by me and sent to you. You can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Beth Steidel in the art department, Becky Kramer and Isabel Lemus Christensen in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the Summer and Winter Tin House Writers Workshop. Finally, I'd like to thank past Between the Covers guest, poet, musician, composer, performer, and much more, Alicia Jo Rabins, for making the intro and outro for the show. You can find out more about her work, her writing, her music, her teaching, her film at aliciajo.com, ALICIAJO.com.